All right, thank you, Congressman, for taking the time to sit down with us. I think just first, let's talk about a couple of current events.
Sure.
I want to get your take on the DHS's investigation, kind of their auditor looking at the facility in Texas and some of the photos that are coming out. Immigration, a big point for candidates. So just what were your thoughts seeing that?
It's disgusting. It's despicable. It's immoral, and it does not represent our American values. So it has to be stopped. And this administration is responsible. Make no mistake, this is the administration that controlled everything in Washington. The Republican Party controlled both houses of Congress and the White House and couldn't get anything done on immigration. Now it's their Department of Homeland Security, it's their Customs and Border Control, it's their ICE that is running these facilities and literally imprisoning children. I think we all know that it's wrong. Democrats stand willing to fix this. We need comprehensive immigration reform. We need to do a lot of things. We need to have a pathway to citizenship for dreamers and people who are already here. We also need to strengthen our borders so that we make sure that people come here legally, not illegally. We need to have a robust asylum system with many more judges to take care of all these people who are coming in and quickly adjudicate their cases. So either they're legally allowed to stay or they're sent back right away. But this administration isn't doing any of this. What it's doing is putting kids in cages, and I think all Americans of all political stripes know that that's wrong.
Not to say you would be paying for the sins of the past, but a decade ago, Democrats were in the same boat and they didn't get immigration reform done as well. So if that continues to be a problem, what would you do as president?
We actually passed a great bill out of the House. It wasn't perfect, but it was a comprehensive immigration reform bill that would have done a lot of the things I described, and it actually would have reduced the federal deficit because it would have put these undocumented people on the tax rolls. But the Senate refused to take it up. Or sorry, I apologize. It was the Senate that passed it. It's the House that refused to take it up under Republican leadership. There are actually a lot of Republican colleagues of mine who know that this is the right thing to do and would vote for that kind of comprehensive immigration reform that the Senate passed. But they're just not willing to even have the debate because they're worried about the political consequences back home. And that's fundamentally what's going on with this president. He's pandering to his political base rather than doing the right thing for the country.
If those roadblocks are there, are you willing to tackle some of that by executive action?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, on day one, there will not be kids in cages under my administration. On day one, we will hire more asylum judges so that we can process everybody quickly. On day one, we will take the money from this silly concrete border wall that reminds me of the Great Wall of China from centuries ago, and instead put it into where border security is needed at the ports of entry, where there are too many drugs coming through, where people are trying to beat the system. That's where we need to strengthen our borders.
Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on the military parade and the celebrations that the president is planning to have for the 4th. He was going to have a small show of force, so to speak, with some military equipment. Do you feel that's appropriate? I know you're rather humble. You don't always like to talk about your military service. I've seen accounts of that. Is that level of showmanship appropriate on this Independence Day?
No, it's not. And it's un-American. It actually reminds me of the Soviet Union or China or North Korea with these military displays. And it's important for Americans to understand this in context. There's no American president in history who's ever done this, who's brought tanks to aggrandize him as president by rolling through the streets of Washington, D.C. And what it says to the troops is the wrong message. It's a militaristic message. It's a message that using the military isn't the last resort. It's something that we're happy to use at the drop of a hat. And that's exactly what this administration has been all about. And at the end of the day, it's because we have a draft dodger as our commander-in-chief, someone who did not have the courage to just tell the truth and go and serve when he was asked to serve his country, and now feels that he has to find ways to make himself look tough.
You've looked at Russia as the short-term threat, China as a longer-term threat, even proposing a Pacific-centered version of NATO, so to speak. So tell me a little bit how that would be structured and how great is that need to have something like that?
You know, we all talk about Donald Trump's failures in terms of keeping the country safe. I've actually spent most of my life keeping America safe, both in the Marines and as a member of the Armed Services Committee in Congress. And I think it's time for a totally new generation of thinking to meet a new generation of challenges. China and Russia are actually attacking us every day, But it's not with nuclear missiles or tanks rolling into Eastern Europe, it's through the internet. So we've got to meet those threats. We've got to contain a rising China by formalizing our alliance in the Pacific the way we have a formal alliance in NATO in Europe. And we have to modernize NATO so that it's prepared to deal with these 21st century threats, undermining democracies through the internet and not just attacking our allies in Eastern and Western Europe. So it's time to really have a sweeping modernization of our Department of Defense. And building a Pacific NATO is one of the steps that I would take to do so.
The president initially seemed open to military response to Iran after the drone was shot down a couple of weeks ago now. He backed off, went the trade route instead. What would have been the appropriate response under your administration had that happened under President Moulton?
Well, what Trump has shown is that he's completely indecisive, and it sends a lot of uncertain signals not only to Iran, but also to our own troops and to our allies. So here's what I would have done. I would have had an immediate decisive response to Iran, but I would not have chosen a military strike in a traditional sense. I would have done a cyber attack. Just take out the power grid where those missiles were shot from in the southern part of Iran to send a clear, unmistakable message that we will not stand for this, but not to escalate the conflict. Second, I would bring our allies together to patrol the Gulf and ensure that it's not just the United States Navy keeping us safe, helping to rebuild some of the alliances that Trump has frayed. And third, I would make it very clear to Iran that here is a pathway to better behavior. If you start treating the region properly, you stop funding terrorists, you stop building your missiles, and you abide by the terms of the nuclear deal, then we'll release the sanctions. But lay out that roadmap for them. The only thing the administration has laid out is regime change, and that's obviously not going to happen. Iran's never going to agree to it. So it's just pushing us towards war. My response would be clear and decisive, but it would keep us out of war, not driving us towards it.
Let's bring it back stateside. Nevada, specifically a state with a large veteran population, just under 10%. Our VA, it was one of the many that had issues several years back. The backlog was of note, the huge one. As a state, we have a physician shortage. So a problem we have, what can we do to recruit medical professionals, including physicians, in a state like this to the VA, especially when the competition is against private hospitals that also have a hard time attracting doctors in a big shortage like we're seeing?
Well, we need to do things to fundamentally change the system, but under my presidency, this will be a priority. And I'm the only candidate in this entire race on either side who actually gets his care at the VA. In fact, that makes me the only candidate who gets single-payer health care, which is a big topic of conversation. And a lot of my Democratic colleagues want to force everybody onto a single-payer system. I don't. I want Medicare to be an option for all, but not a requirement. And I want private health care insurance to still be there for those who want it. And if those two options compete against each other, it will bring down prices for everybody. In the case of the VA, competition means that they're going to have to up their game. And whether they need to do a better job with recruiting through higher salaries, better benefits, whatever they need to do to get the physicians that they need, they'll know that they're in a competitive system, and that will be good for veterans. It'll be good for everybody.
In light of the Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting, guns have continued to be a huge topic here in Nevada. The legislature went back to Democratic control, a Democratic governor, so complete control this time around this session. Background checks for private sales, that passed through fairly easily, but even a bump stock ban, that was a bill that was almost hijacked. They had a tough time getting that through. So it's a hot button topic here. It's a hot button across the country. As far as getting gun reform done, what do you want to see done in your term if you're elected president?
I want to see background checks like you have in Nevada now across the country without exception. And the studies show, although there aren't many of them because Congress refuses to study this, what studies there are show that background checks is the single best thing to reduce gun violence. I also want to make sure that weapons of war, things that you do not need to go hunting, like bump stocks, are off the streets. And I say that as someone who's had to use weapons of war. Again, the only candidate in this race who has actually had to use guns, and guns have saved my life in combat. But that means I've also seen gun violence firsthand. And I know the consequences of this in a very personal way. And there's no need for weapons of war on our streets or on our schools. So I will push Congress to act. And in fact, I had the two most bipartisan gun reform bills in the last Congress. I will continue that route, but I will also use the threat of executive action to force Congress's hand. It's much better if these reforms are passed through Congress, because when you get a bipartisan group of lawmakers to agree on them, they're much harder to undo down the road. But we need common sense gun reform, the kind of things that the majority of Americans agree with. That does not mean taking away the Second Amendment. I have a lot of good friends who love to hunt, and I enjoy hunting sometimes myself. But that's fine. What's not fine is having weapons of war on our streets.
Nevadans are still just now getting out of the effects of the recession. We were one of the hardest hit states. One thing that we are always looking at when we talk about proposals are costs. You've signed on to the Green New Deal. You know that the cost estimates that have come out with that.
Well, that's not the Green New Deal I signed on to. I signed on to the Green New Deal before it had any of these things like guaranteed jobs, which I disagree with. What the Green New Deal should be focused on is climate change. And so that's why I released what I think would be my components of a Green New Deal. Things like investing in the next generation of green technology so that we lead the world, not China, in selling these technologies not just here at home, but all across the globe. In developing carbon capture technology, which is sometimes controversial with people because they think that's an excuse to continue polluting. But what carbon capture does is take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we need to do that right now because even if we stopped polluting tomorrow, there's already too much carbon in the air right now. I'm also going to engage young Americans in this fight, and I've proposed a federal Green Corps to help make America more climate resilient. That means strengthening our riverbanks, rebuilding seawalls, all the things that we need to do to address climate change that's happening today, that's having effects on our economy today. And if you train young Americans to do this job through a national service program, by engaging them in serving their country, it'll not only be a good thing for bringing Americans together, it will help teach jobs, new green jobs in the thriving economy to the next generation.
So for some of those initiatives, can you tell Nevadans, maybe lower income or middle class Nevadans, that that's not going to really hit them in the pocketbook?
Well, that's why it's so important that we develop these technologies here at home. Because right now, Nevada is one of the country's leaders in solar energy, and you have some vast solar farms, but almost all of those panels come from China. So China is profiting off of Nevada's investment in solar energy. I want those jobs here in America, in states like Nevada, to develop the next generation of green technologies that we can sell to the rest of the world.
I think finally we talk about being one of the early states, unlike Iowa or New Hampshire. We look a little bit different. We are, we would say, a little more representative of the country. So as you've spent some time on the ground now here, what are you hearing from voters? What are the issues that you would want to champion for Nevadans?
Well, I'm hearing that they want health care reform. They want to make sure that everybody has a right to health care, which I believe in to my core. But they also appreciate the fact that I'm speaking from the experience of going to the VA, and I want to make sure it's good health care for everybody. That's why I support President Obama's vision of a public option that competes against private health care plans rather than forcing everybody onto a government-run system. I'm hearing that they want to restore moral leadership to the White House. They want a commander-in-chief that they can trust. And that's what I'm offering to Nevada voters. You know, I'm not someone who's going to agree with you on every issue. I'm going to go out, I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to hold town halls. In fact, I held more town halls in Congress than any other Democrat in my first term, House or Senate. I'm going to do that as president too, because listening to you is what matters. But at the end of the day, whether we agree or not, I want Nevada voters to know that they can trust me, that I'm a commander-in-chief who will work tirelessly to keep them safe, as I have for a good portion of my life. And I'm someone that they can look up to and their kids can look up to for leadership back in the White House.
Congressman, I appreciate you taking some time with us.
Thank you.